Hello everyone, my name is Emily Matson and I'm going to be talking about the brain anatomy and the functions that come along with it. So the first part I'm going to be talking about is the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain that coordinates movement and regulates temperature. It is the outermost wrinkled portion that we can see. As we can see here, it is just this whole part of the brain. And the outermost wrinkled portion of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex, which is made up of gray matter. There is a large separation between the two sides of the cerebrum that is called the longitudinal fissure. We can see right down the middle here. And it separates the cerebrum into two distinct halves, a right and left cerebral hemisphere. When going back and looking into the cerebral cortex, we mentioned that there was a thin gray matter. As you can see here, we have the gray matter that is all on the outside, and then we have the white matter that is all in the inside here. And this thin gray matter is wrinkled, and when there is extensive wrinkles, these extensive wrinkles are responsible for higher function of the nervous system. A gyrus or gyri is the ridge of one of those wrinkles, and a sulcus or a sulci is the groove between two of those gyri. So as I've shown here over here on the right, a gyri, as we see, is a groove, and a sulci is a dip. And the gray matter would be here in this groove, and the white matter would be more here in a dip in this area. Extensive folding in the cerebral cortex enables more gray matter to fit into the limited space of the skull. So now I'm going to be talking about the different lobes of the brain, and they can be divided into 4 separate lobes. We have the frontal lobe in the front of the brain. We have the parietal lobe, which could be semi in the middle top of the brain. We have the temporal, which is in the lower portion of the brain, and then the occipital lobe, which is in the back of the brain. So the occipital lobe can also be known as the primary visual cortex, and that is found in the back, as we talked about over here. And that is mostly responsible for all of our visual processing. So anything to do with our eyes, understanding colors, objects, what we're seeing, anything to do with that is going to be determined and understood from the back of our brain. The next lobe is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is associated with the primary auditory cortex and the auditory association area. Anything to do with hearing will be understood by the temporal lobe. Ringing, music, understanding sounds will all be dealt with the temporal lobe, and this could be connected as it is towards the side of our brain and kind of towards the side of our head where our ears are, right? So that one makes a little more sense, so you can understand that the temporal lobe is towards the side of our head where our ears are generally located. The next one is the parietal lobe, and this one is associated with the somatosensation, meaning the general sensations associated with the body. So with the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe, there is this big groove between them called the central sulcus, right down the middle here. And it's this big groove that divides the frontal and parietal lobe. You can see it over here on this one as well. It's this big giant groove that divides between the two. And right behind this big giant groove is the primary somatosensory cortex. As we can see right here, it says, and all of the tactile senses are processed in this area in the parietal lobe, such as touch, pressure, tickle, pain, itch, vibration, and other general senses of the body. So anything that you feel on your body, like it says, tickle, brushing, pressure, itches, chills, anything that you feel will all be felt by that sensation, by that somatosensory cortex on that parietal lobe. For the last lobe, it's the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is very simple. It is described as the front of the brain. And it is right in front of the central sulcus. So the parietal was posterior to the central sulcus, or right behind it, and the frontal is anterior to the central sulcus, or in front of the central sulcus. So cells from this region, I'm getting ahead of myself. In front of the central sulcus is the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe. And this primary motor cortex is the cortex for motor neurons that instruct cells in the spinal cord to move skeletal muscles. So, what it is telling us is, it is telling cells to move skeletal muscles in the spinal cord. It is saying, hey, the skeletal muscles need to move. It is helping the skeletal muscles like, oh, we need to move our arms. We need to move our limbs. We need to get things moving. What it also does, it serves cognitive functions that can be the basis of personalities. So it also gives us our personalities, as well as serves our short-term memory and our consciousness. So our frontal lobe does a lot of important things. Not only does it help move our skeletal muscles, but it also helps define who we are with our personalities, helps our short-term memory, and helps our consciousness. A lot to think about with these lobes. The next part I'm going to talk about is the diencephalon, and this is the connection between the cerebrum and the rest of the nervous system. And this is located deep beneath the cerebrum. It has two major regions, and that is the thalamus, which we can see right here, this green area, and the hypothalamus, right down in here. The thalamus relays information between the cerebral cortex and the periphery system, the spinal cord, and the brainstem. All sensory information, except for the sense of smell, so sight, hearing, taste, and touch, passes through the thalamus before processing by the cerebral cortex. The thalamus, however, does not just pass the information on, but it also processes all of this information. Below and slightly in front of the thalamus, as we can see in the diagram, is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is largely involved in regulating homeostasis, a state of balance in the body where everything is functioning properly to survive. The hypothalamus is the executive region in charge of involuntary neurological processes, such as heart rate, blood pressure, everything that you don't have to think about, and the endocrine system through its regulation of the pituitary gland, which you can see is right here. The pituitary gland is an endocrine gland, meaning that it produces chemical messengers called hormones that regulate various functions in the body. The next part I'm going to talk about is the cerebellum, and cerebellum is coined or termed the little brain. It is covered in gyri and sulci, like the cerebrum, and it looks like a miniature version of the brain. The cerebellum is largely responsible for comparing information from the cerebrum with sensory feedback from the periphery system through the spinal cord. The cerebellum plays an important role in coordination and fine-tuning of motor commands. Very short and sweet and very simple. The next part I'm going to talk about is the brainstem, and the brainstem has a lot of other components attached to it that I will get to. So the brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord. The major ascending and descending pathways between the spinal cord and brain, specifically the cerebrum, pass through the brainstem. The midbrain, which we can see right in here, is a small region between the thalamus and pons, which is right here as we can see, that coordinates sensory representations of the visual, auditory, and somatosensory perceptual spaces, as we talked about before in the different lobes that we were talking about. The midbrain contains visual reflex centers that coordinate eye and head movements and triggers the blink reflex within our eyes. It contains centers that trigger reflexes related to sound perceptions, such as when you turn your head towards an unexpected noise. The pons, when we talked about, the word comes from the Latin word for bridge. It is visible on the anterior surface of the brainstem as a thick bundle. As we see, it kind of protrudes out and looks as if it is being a giant bundle around the brainstem itself. As a thick bundle of white matter attached to the cerebellum, the pons is the main connection between the cerebellum and the brainstem. The medulla, or the medulla oblongata, as it is labeled here, it forms the connection between the brain and the spinal cord. It contains the pyramidal tracts, which sends motor signals from the motor cortex down into the spinal cord. These tracts cross over within the medulla, resulting in the right motor cortex controlling the left side of the body and the left motor cortex controlling the right side of the body. Sensory information traveling from the spinal cord also passes through the medulla. Along with the pons, the medulla also helps to regulate the autonomic functions of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems, meaning it does those involuntary actions that you don't have to think about. Breathing, heart rate, beating the heart, all those things that are involuntary that we don't have to process or think about and are second nature to us. The last thing I'm going to talk about are the meninges. So in the previous chapter, we talked about the dura mater, the thick fibrous layer and the strong protective sheath over the entire brain, which can be seen right here and also right here. The middle layer, which is the arachnoid matter, the membrane of thick fibrous tissue, which would be this light pink one over here and this light orange one here. And then the most inner layer, which is the pia mater, that is also a thin fibrous matter, which here would be this very thin purple right here and this very thin one over here. There is also the subarachnoid space that is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which protects and cushions the brain and the spinal cord. The cerebrospinal fluid is produced by filtration of the blood that enters the brain. This filtration is accomplished by a specialized membrane called the choroid plexus. The cerebrospinal fluid circulates to remove metabolic waste from the nervous tissues and returns them to the bloodstream. The ventricles are the open spaces within the brain where this fluid circulates. The fluid circulates through all of the ventricles to eventually emerge into the subarachnoid space where it will be reabsorbed into the venous blood within the dural sinuses. When we first learned all of this, it was applied to the spinal cord, but all of these layers surround the brain too. One additional note to add is that there are small one-way valves called arachnoid granulations that allow the cerebrospinal fluid to flow from the subarachnoid spaces as well. I hope all of this was able to help you for the upcoming exam. This was thankfully a great refresher for me, and I hope this was able to help you as well.